Hello and welcome to Jesuitical, a podcast from American Media for saints and sinners. You can join us each week for honest conversations about the Catholic Church and our world today, sometimes over drinks. I'm Ashley McKinless, and I'm joined by Zach Davis.
I'm sorry, Ashley, I can barely hear you. The Rocky theme song has just been playing in my ear for days.
What you got there?
This is, an Olympic gold medal.
Participation trophy?
It's the world's nicest participation trophy. This is the proof that I ran the New York City Marathon.
Yeah, I can't believe I have my voice back because on Monday I could barely talk from all of the cheering.
You did a great job cheering.
Nothing compared to the feat of running 26.2 miles with the newborn, finishing. It was a beautiful day. It was fantastic.
It's so fun. I always tell people, New York City Marathon, whether you're running or not, whether you know someone running or not, greatest day in the city.
It really
Vibes are so good. Everyone's supporting each other. In finishing in Central Park, it feels like the whole world is sort of carrying you to the finish line. That's my image of walking into heaven from now on.
There we go.
So,
and how are you feeling? The legs still a little sore?
It's going to take me a while to stand up from this chair. Yes. But good news, I don't have to for a little bit because we have a fantastic episode this week.
We sure do. And it is all about St. John Henry Newman, the newest doctor of the church. He was made a doctor by Pope Leo at a mass in St. Peter's Square on Saturday. And our guest was actually in attendance for that mass.
That's right. This week we're talking to Dr. Christopher Cimorelli, who is the director of the National Institute for Newman Studies and also editor of the Newman Studies Journal. So we wanted to just give a 101 on who St. John Henry Newman is, what are his big contributions to Catholic thought. So it's a bit of a theology nerd episode this week for sure. And when we get to Signs of the Times, it'll double down on that as well. But it's a ton of fun. We make it accessible. So stay tuned. We also have a great drink recommendation.
One thing making it more accessible is our drink this week, which comes recommended by none other than Dr. John Henry Newman, who wrote about loving a fine, strong beer. So we are having a Duvel. Is that how you say it?
I think so.
A Belgian strong blonde.
It's delicious. I love Belgian beer. This is great. It's not English like John Henry Newman, but very good.
Yep. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, so stick around in a bit for our conversation with Chris Cimorelli about Dr. John Henry Newman. But first, we have Signs of the Times, the part of our show where we sift through the Catholic news of the week so you don't have to. What's our first story, Zach?
So we got some news from Pope Leo on Tuesday. By the way, I thought we were done with his impromptu Tuesday press conferences, but they're back this week. So he was leaving Castel Gandolfo on Tuesday, which is he's been taking as his day off, and he's been spending at Castel Gandolfo. And on his way out, he was stopped and asked about the various things happening in the United States, specifically in regards to the Trump administration's treatment of migrants, and brought up some stories that we've talked about on this show already.
Yeah, so over the last 3 weeks, there have been 2 Eucharistic processions that have approached a ICE detention facility just outside of Chicago, so Pope Leo's hometown, and they've tried to gain access to give communion to the immigrant detainees inside those facilities and have been rebuffed by ICE. And so in his comments, Pope Leo said that, he was kind of advocating for the spiritual rights of migrants and encouraged authorities in the United States to give access to the sacraments to these detainees.
Yeah, and which is what the church on the ground here has been advocating for, but now they've got Pope Leo's remarks and plea behind it. So we'll see if that makes any difference at all. And their attempts, I think they're going to go back and try to bring communion again, because right now these people are often separated from their families, but they're also separated from the sacraments. And the least the church could do is be allowed in to bring communion to them.
And speaking of the church in the U.S. Pushing back on this, Bishop Robert Barron, the day before Pope Leo spoke out, posted on social media that he had been assured by Trump administration officials that this matter was under careful review. Barron is someone that Trump appointed to be on the Department of Justice Religious Liberty Commission. So he's, framing it like Leo as a matter of religious liberty.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think the significance of Pope Leo weighing in on this. I mentioned we thought that these press conferences were over, but he's sort of establishing his way of communicating and remarking on the news, which was always going to be interesting to watch because Pope Francis had his way, which usually took the form of random interviews that dropped by surprise or papal plain press conferences. But it looks like this is Leo's way of choosing when to weigh in.
Yeah, and I don't want to try to read too much into it, but the fact that he said it, that he said anything at all after a couple of weeks of kind of not talking to the press in this
and at one time
way.
explicitly saying, like, I wish to not weigh in on a political situation in the United States.
And then doing it in English, so he knows it's going to be heard by the United States. And this is a little speculation, but it came a week before the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are going to be meeting for their annual fall meeting in Baltimore, and one of the topics for discussion is migration. So I don't know, maybe he was choosing his moment to say something and send a message to the bishop, because we know that Pope Leo praised Pope Francis's unprecedented letter to all of the U.S. bishops, urging them to oppose mass deportations under the Trump administration. So I don't know. I think it's significant that it happened when it happened.
Yeah, and we'll see if it has any effect on several levels, whether it helps the situation on the ground and bringing pastoral care to migrants in detention, or if it shapes the direction of the U.S. bishops meeting in Baltimore next week.
Yep.
What's our next story, Ashley?
Yeah, so last week, Barcelona's Sagrada Familia basilica became the world's tallest church when a part of its central tower was lifted into place on top of it.
Yeah, so Sagrada Familia is now topping out at 534 feet. This is, of course, Gaudi's, signature project that has been being built for a long time now, and it just surpassed Germany's Ulmer Münster Cathedral, which also had been built for a long time, started in the 14th century, completed in the 19th century. So Sagrada Familia now on top.
Yeah, so the construction of Sagrada Familia started in 1882, and so Gaudi never expected to see it built to its completion, which that in itself is a great testament of, like, you can start things as a Christian and they will grow once you're gone. But I also just like that it's still being built, because often I'm walking around Brooklyn and I go to these gorgeous churches from a previous time and think to myself, we would never build something this ambitious today. But in fact, at least someone is.
Yeah, we are. We still are. Can't say we don't make them like this anymore, because we still do. What is our last story, Ashley?
Yeah, this one's going to take some unpacking. So this week, the Vatican's doctrinal office weighed in on a controversy surrounding the titles we give to the Virgin Mary. And frankly, I didn't know much about this controversy. I think you maybe knew a bit more, but the Vatican has ruled.
That's right. So there is a new document. The document is called Mater Populi Fidelis, which in English is the Mother of the Faithful People of God. It came out this Tuesday and was presented by the prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Fernandez. And really at the heart of this document are two titles in particular. It goes into a lot, but the two ones that we need to talk about are Mary, describing Mary as Co-redemptrix or co-redeemer, and the Mediatrix of all graces.
Or mediator of all graces.
Yes, that's right. So these titles ultimately were rejected or deemed to be not appropriate by the Vatican because they continue to either require a ton of explanation or just outright confuse and mislead people about Mary's specific role in the salvation of humanity.
Yeah, so I've since done a deep dive on this controversy, so I think I can try to explain, like, what do we mean by co-redeemer? What did they mean before it was, not allowed?
Yeah.
And the idea is that Mary cooperated in a very unique way in the saving redemptive mission of Jesus. And she did this at her at the Annunciation. She did this by being the mother who raised Jesus. And then she did this by being at the foot of the cross when Jesus died. So because of that very active role, like, it can seem like redemption relied on Mary, which is not what people mean by the term. But that's why there's a
lot of confusion on this. Yeah, because ultimately, I mean, the question, the way I phrase this is, Mary could have said no at the Annunciation, right? It was a free act. And if she had said no, God would have found another way to save humanity. And I don't know that that's like been explicitly said in this authoritative way before, which this is really about kind of the limits of language and our understanding. You know, if I say I cooperate with you in founding this podcast, did you found the podcast or did we found it together?
And and they use the the mystery of Christ's role as sole redeemer and mediator. So it's a mystery, and we're trying to kind of draw these fine lines about what Mary didn't do in that mystery.
Well, no, and the thing that we're like ultimately trying to hold the line on is that it is God in Christ alone who saves, right? That they are the actor, they are the ones responsible for it. It is of their own initiative, and it is not dependent upon any created being. Mary, even though Mary is such an important created being.
Yeah. And then for the role of mediator, I think that gets closer to how people relate to Mary in prayer. Would you say that's fair? Because
I think so.
It's her role kind of giving out blessings to people on earth who pray to her, but what the church wants to hold firm on is that the grace comes from Christ alone. It passes through Mary in some way so that we can't quite put into words, but we don't want to give the impression that Mary has her own store of graces that she's doling out that don't come from Jesus,
or even that she has to be the mediator of all of the grace that comes from God, right? The image that the document uses, like if you can imagine grace is like a fountain. It's not like Mary's hands are like a filter or a sieve that like are sort of distributing the graces after that. Yeah. Obviously, Mary is incredibly helpful in bringing our petitions to God. I think we see that in the gospel, and this document brings up the story of the wedding at Cana many times as sort of like the example for how Mary intercedes for us, right? She doesn't tell Jesus what to do. She just tells Jesus, they don't have any wine. And then she tells the servants, do whatever Jesus tells you, which I think is like a perfect way of thinking about how Mary operates in the spiritual life.
Yeah. And then one question people might have is, why now? Why make this pronouncement? And apparently the Vatican's first study of the doctrinal implications of these terms, it was back in 1926. And it's been kind of like a bubbling concern for popes in the modern era. Some use it, some don't use these terms. But in the last 30 years, it's been something that the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith has been studying, and kind of in response to requests from Catholics, including some bishops, that they, make it dogma that these are titles for Mary.
That's right, because in the early church, there were titles for Mary that were actually...
There's a million of them.
There's a million, but some of them resulted in some pretty intense theological battles. Like, so is Mary the mother of God was a question that the early church faced with some pretty profound implications, because it dealt with whether Jesus was fully God or fully human or both, right? Ultimately, they decided that Theotokos, that mother of God, was actually a very appropriate title for Mary, but it didn't mean it wasn't contentious. Yeah. And I would say that this debate was also contentious. There was someone in the presentation of the document who stood up and was very angry.
The document also mentions people taking to social media to like make the case for these terms in ways that they said could be, confusing for ordinary members of the faithful.
Yeah. So I think I appreciated the document for a couple of reasons. One, it, I think, clarifies some pretty thorny theological concepts that can sometimes feel in the weeds, but I do think that this, instinct that we have, this for Marian devotion as Catholics, is something that is natural and good, and something that you see pop up all over the world in every culture that the church has been, in sort of a unique and culturated way. And so it's not trying to discourage Marian devotion, but it is definitely trying to direct it or correct it, I think.
Yeah, they actually speak really beautifully of, popular Marian piety in this document, especially as Mary, that's someone that the poor really, really look to and see in her, someone who is accompanying them and who understands their struggles. And so, yeah, like you said, they're not in any way trying to tamp down on that sort of devotion, just kind to to direct it in an appropriate way that doesn't somehow make Mary equal to Jesus Christ, which is obviously something that a lot of non-Catholics would accuse Catholics of doing.
Yeah, I think a lot of Catholics experience this when they're talking to their Protestant friends or family members, is that it's like, you guys, seems like you guys worship Mary, and we don't, and we are at pains to explain that we don't. And I thought this was a really good story for us this week, since we're talking about St. John Henry Newman and the development of doctrine. This is sort of like a real example, or an example in real time of how doctrine develops, because the document cites that these terms, Mediatrix of all graces or Co-redemptrix, have been used throughout the Church's history, and even as recently as St. John Paul II had used the term, not necessarily in a precise way. And we were kind of sorting it out. You mentioned that in 1926 the Vatican had a commission on this. Took us 99 years to study it and kind of come down on one side definitively. Look, these things are messy, and we figure them out as a church, and I thought that's why this story was important.
Now stick around for a conversation with Chris Cimorelli about St. John Henry Newman, conscience, the development of doctrine, and the role of the laity in the Catholic Church. Joining us from Pittsburgh is Christopher Cimorelli. Chris is the director of the National Institute for Newman Studies and the editor of the Newman Studies Journal. Welcome to Jesuitical, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
And you are freshly back from Rome. You were at the Mass where St. John Henry Newman was declared a doctor of the Church. Just quickly, how was it?
Honestly, it was surreal. I mean, unlike some of my colleagues, I didn't have the pleasure of being there in 2019. But I mean, we're talking
for the canonization,
right,
when he was declared a saint.
But we're talking about like special, Jubilee Year of Hope, a special Jubilee event on education, All Saints Day, the piazza outside of St. Peter's, Newman's banner raised high, pilgrims as far as the eye could see. From all over.
And there are only 38 doctors. There are a ton of saints. So this is an elite club that you got to be a part of or join for the Mass.
That's right. So yeah, the setting was really dramatic. Really cool.
Well, and Newman has had this sort of rapid rise. He was beatified, I think, in 2010. So it's right, in just 15 years to go from blessed to doctor of the Church that feels quick to me. Did it feel quick to the Newman devotees, or I imagine it's been a lot of work these 15 years?
Yeah, it has been a lot of work, but it is incredibly fast. But I think in Newman's case, there was a great sense that he was a doctor of the Church, but we needed to kind of have his miracles in place. And then once he became a saint, it was pretty quick after that.
So we're planning for this to be a bit of a 101 on St. Newman. So let's start with just some historical context. What was his bio up until maybe the point where he converted to Catholicism?
So he basically, his life kind of takes up the 19th century. It's born in 1801, passes away in 1890. But he as he grows up, if people are aware of his biography at all, he talks about even early on, like as a teenager, reading Augustine and others and kind of having a moment of conversion, even as a young man, being convinced of the reality of the faith, the reality of God, and even the reality of dogma in some sense. But in his early life, and especially as he's kind of graduating from Oxford and becoming a fellow at Oriel College, he's much more in like an evangelical mode of Anglicanism. And so if anybody happens to read sermons of his from that time, they can be quite fiery. He doesn't pull any punches, and he's kind of, if he's in a theological mode, it's more of like the atonement and the crucifixion. Whereas if you kind of proceed in his life in the mid 1820s, he starts to really have a growth in his kind of sacramental worldview. And over the next kind of 10 years, really develops that worldview and becomes much more centered on something like the incarnation. And so this leads him in the course of the 1830s, after he had a lack of success instituting reforms at Oriel College, where he was really interested in kind of personal formation and influence. Once that's kind of taken away from him, he devotes himself fully to his studies of history, the Church Fathers, and has to go on this journey of trying to think about the continuity of the faith and how we can make sense of history and all of the conflict and the discord, and how it seems like doctrines that we don't find in Scripture start to get proclaimed by the church. And so he needs to kind of figure this out for himself. And he goes into the history of the church and the fathers to really try to do that.
And can you situate us in this sort of interreligious debate at the time? Because Newman is part of a group of people, the Oxford movement, and this series of sort of high-profile conversions to Catholicism. But even before the conversion, they were trying to make some reforms of the Anglican Church, correct?
That's exactly right. So you see kind of Newman is trying to position himself between certain extremes. And he used to call the traditional church at the time high and dry, or like there's a sense that there was like stale orthodoxy. But there were also people that were overly sentimental and evangelical, and in his sense, like this is not what religion is really about. So they were trying to like go into the period of the early church, grounded in Scripture and the fathers, to try to bring this orthodoxy, this kind of inspiration into the present. And so the Oxford movement wanted to reinvigorate the Church of England. And it was relying not only on the church fathers in Scripture, but also on some of the Anglican divines from early in the history of the Church of England, something that had seemingly been lost over the previous couple hundred years.
And what's like the broader context in the society that the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, these movements exist in? Because I think we moderns tend to think, secularism and like the new atheism was the first time the church had to really combat rationalism, and before the last couple of decades, everyone was going to church and that sort of thing. But he was, as you mentioned, he spans the 19th century. This is post-Enlightenment. It's when the Industrial Revolution is happening. There's a lot of turmoil in the world around him. And so how is he responding to that?
Yeah. And I mean, it's a really great question. And when you read Newman, you realize, because he's such a controversialist, you realize that many of the questions that we have and the debates we're having, he was having. He was an inheritor of kind of the English empirical tradition, debates with like Hume and Locke and others who are trying to discuss evidence and the grounds for belief. So he's thoroughly involved in that. And he's in a moment where things are changing. Society's changing, religion's changing. On the one hand, you have kind of like these attempts by the government to try to interfere with the Church of England as he saw it. So he was very kind of early on sensitive to that and wanted to fight against some of the reforms of the time period, but while also, wanting to give better grounds for religious belief and knowledge. And so the world, in a sense, was becoming smaller. There was much more awareness of other religions. Communication was the speed of communication was increasing. And so it's almost like there were many fronts on which to fight. And Newman wanted to prepare the church and prepare believers to kind of, have that fight and do well in it.
And when he is approaching his conversion to Catholicism, it kind of comes as like a crisis of faith. I mean, I could see how, if you're disturbed by the state meddling in church affairs, that religion where the supreme monarch sort of is a part of the church hierarchy structure and is sort of insular from state meddling, that might be attractive. But what are the things that are drawing him to Catholicism, and what makes him finally kind of get pushed over the edge and cross the Tiber?
Yeah, so Newman, I guess it's like mid to late 1830s. He's writing a work that comes down to us as the Via Media, Volume 1. And in that, he's trying to kind of position the Church of England between extremes of Protestantism and Catholicism. But he always, according to his biography, he always felt like the work was just paper. It was abstract. And he wasn't satisfied with the way that he positioned the Church of England. And he was really kind of focusing on the fact that the Church of England, unlike the others, has maintained a principle of apostolicity. Catholicity as a principle, like the global church, that's been lost since all of the corruptions of Rome and the spread of Christianity. But meanwhile, in his studies of the church, he starts looking at the 5th century. He starts looking at the Christological controversies. He's looking at Augustine and the Donatists. And he starts to realize that, well, wait a minute. Augustine, 400 something years into the faith, is talking about how the principle of Catholicity is still alive and the church is still making these judgments. And so Newman says that he began to see his own position as something of like a semi-Arian, somewhere in between Arianism and Catholicism, and that he felt, well, wait a minute, the principle of Catholicity is still in force. So the history of the church kind of revealed the limitations of his own view of the church. And so he begins to kind of seek a living, vital presence of like the church that can adjudicate the faith, make judgments, and preserve what was revealed, and has the gift of the Holy Spirit. And so eventually he comes to see that despite some of the things he might be uncomfortable with, the Catholic Church became to him the one church that Christ intended.
And what were some of the things that made him uncomfortable?
Well, so when he talks about doctrine, for example, he might call them accretions or corruptions in earlier works, but certain things seem to have, given him pause, like Middle Ages, some of the developments in theology, intricacies of scholastic thought. I think the Via Media provides some pretty good examples. But
maybe like honing in on one is infallibility, because that debate is raging in Newman's lifetime, correct?
It certainly is. So with infallibility, so he says in the Via Media that, whereas we want to judge things on the basis of like the church, the Bible, the apostles, the apostolic church, for the Roman, they're really just justifying things by invoking infallibility, right? Now he uses that as a criticism in the late 1830s. And when he writes his first edition of an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, he actually leaves that in there. He includes an excerpt of that and basically admits like, well, this was a criticism and it still stands as a criticism, but actually it's the truth. So now that said, even by the time you get to 1870 and the First Vatican Council, Newman didn't think it was necessary to define infallibility because he said Catholics believe this, and he felt like it would be a really problematic definition. This is beforehand, because of the rise of historical consciousness and the way people would attack the faith. He felt that this could cause a lot of problems for people's conscience if it was defined. But once it is defined, he accepts it and helps others accept it as well.
Well, and one of the things I appreciate about Newman is he's critical of even the decision that maybe comes out of the First Vatican Council, but is sort of just trusting in this long arc of church history, and maybe this is in his belief in conscience, which we'll get to later. But look, it's probably going to get ironed. All the details are going to get ironed out later on anyway. So I don't need to stress that if they overemphasized one thing or another in this particular proclamation or teaching.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's one of the great gifts he gives is that this is why it's so important to attend to the history of the church. Because when you look at the long history of the church, you see these ebbs and flows. You see that sometimes something is defined and, oh, wait a minute, once it's defined, we might have to not necessarily course correct, but we have to then look to another angle of it to provide some balance. If you're going to say that the Son is consubstantial with the Father, well, what about the Spirit? You got to say something about the Spirit. So, Nicaea to Constantinople, to Chalcedon, these are all related. So Newman takes this long view of the church. He's not afraid of conflict. He's not afraid of dark moments in the church. As a matter of fact, he incorporates them into his theories precisely so that the believers can be bolstered in understanding that not everything is going to get settled in my lifetime. And I think that's a tremendous gift to the church.
I think if someone looked at the just the title, essay on the development of Christian doctrine, it could seem like a a prescriptive thing or like a how-to guide of like, here's what you don't like in the church. Here's how you can develop it. But it's really much more of like a historical backwards looking thing. Like, where did we start and how can I reconcile myself to being a part of this Catholic institution that looks so different than the early church? So is it basically him like talking himself into how the Catholic Church can be right and so different?
Yeah, I do think there's a little bit of confusion sometimes. When Newman wrote the essay, yes, it's kind of a way to look back at history to feel comfortable and have a strong sense of belief that the church that I am in and worshiping in today is the church from 2,000 years ago. So that's absolutely the case. But I would say, even to that point, while some people might want to use the essay to justify any kind of development, which I don't think Newman would be for that type of a project. But what the essay should, I think, do is give you a sense that the church is alive and that as a living idea, something that's being worked out in the lives of believers as they confront challenges and face new questions, that it is living and we all have a part to play in it. And we honestly don't know exactly where it's going to go. So that's why everything that we do matters. And so I think that's another gift that Newman gives to the church.
How would he talk about truth? Because I think a lot of people would be like, the truth is the truth. It's not living. It's there. It's objective.
Yeah, and Newman certainly is all about truth. And he said the principle of dogma, that God would commit truths to history that then are expressed in propositions. I mean, again, Newman is entirely about that from an early age, and he's not willing to give it up. But then again, when you look at history, right, Newman also kind of tracked how in the 3rd century, the word consubstantial or homoousios was kind of rejected because it was used in an incorrect sense with respect to the Trinity. And yet, less than a century later, it becomes the mark of orthodoxy in 325. So again,
and even with that, and even just there in 325, so it's defined. But for the next 60 years, Newman points out that bishops were still kind of waffling on it. And Newman has this observation that it's actually the laity who kind of safeguard this teaching on Jesus' divine nature, like that the sort of episcopal level of the church was waffling at that time, and it's the sense of the faithful that kind of carries that through, which I think is just like one brilliant as an observation, and has kind of like it has some profound implications for us today.
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons why in the 2014 document from the International Theological Commission, Sensus Fidei in the Life of the Church, that Newman is referenced like 37 times. It's astonishing. But yeah, his On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine, a major work from the 1850s. And Newman keeps kind of playing around with those ideas, even as he's editing works in the 1870s. And what you see is that as a Catholic, he's really wrestling with this because, yes, in the Arian controversy, the laity does step up to the plate, and they're willing to defend the faith even when some bishops aren't. So by the 1870s, when Newman's editing his first major work, Arians of the 4th Century, he includes part of On Consulting the Faithful. And that's where I think he shows us kind of the complementarity of different instruments of tradition, magisterium being one of them, sense of the faithful being another one. And even though the magisterium had defined the consubstantial with the Father, right, even though that was defined and that was the presence of the magisterium throughout the controversy, he thought there was another instrument of tradition, the sense of the faithful, that stepped up in the interval and kind of safeguarded the faith until we could get to the end of that century.
So going back to his conversion, how was he received by the Catholic leaders of his time? Because these ideas are all very familiar to us now, but that's because we live in the post-Vatican II church where so many of his ideas were incorporated. But back in the mid-19th century, was he seen as a radical?
Yeah, some people like to say that the church wanted his conversion, not his theology. But I think that's a little bit overstated. I mean, there are some really good studies that have come out over the last couple decades looking at Newman and how actually there was some receptivity on the part of the Roman school and theologians like Perrone of Newman's ideas, even though there was pushback as well.
Just like broadly set up the camps when you say the Roman school.
Yeah, like coming out of Rome and the Jesuits and others, like there was a sense of like standard theology, a lot of scholastic influence, Thomas Aquinas, but at the same time, again, that picture is too limited because there were a lot of things happening in Germany with historical theology, other figures also working on theories of development. So I think, generally speaking, it's like St. Thomas and scholastic thought seems to be dominant in the church at the time, which is why Newman didn't really consider himself a theologian in any meaningful sense. And yet, but the picture is much more complicated. And I think a lot of studies are showing that. But even so, Newman struggles as a Catholic. His first couple of decades in the church, he doesn't seem to have the success that he was having as a member of the Church of England and authoring these, transformational works. Even the idea of a university, which is a classic to us today, his Irish university didn't really work out the way that he wanted to. And so he struggles. And you see this in his kind of biographical account, his autobiographical account. And so it's not until kind of the Apologia Pro Vita Sua that Newman seems to have a breakthrough as a Catholic in the mid-1860s, where all of a sudden his attempts to defend his faith as a Catholic in England with a lot of prejudice and anti-Catholic sentiment were all of a sudden now he's seen with in a much more positive light, but by Catholics, but also even by Anglicans who wanted to know more about why he converted.
Well, and you're talking about the spread of communication earlier, changing pretty rapidly at the time. He was something, I think he would have been on Catholic Twitter or maybe Catholic YouTube, because he's writing in journals that are both critical of the church, sort of part of the institutional church. This is like a part of, I think, church history where we're, really starting to birth some of these projects that we now take for granted, like intellectual magazines and Catholic journalism and things like that. But he is writing in these popular magazines that are read by both laity and hierarchs in Rome at the time. I think he joked when he was named a cardinal that perhaps Rome hadn't read everything he had written. Is that right? Hopefully, I presume Rome has read everything that he's written now.
They ought to have, yeah.
Yeah. But what's his reputation, and why was he so surprised when he's named a cardinal?
And again, I mentioned that the first couple of decades of his time in the church were without much success. It does seem, and historical studies have shown, that he did have enemies, or those that were kind of against him. And the biographies of Newman can kind of outline that better than I can. But yeah, he did have detractors, and some that, there are situations where he would try to respond to some sort of question about his teaching, but it wasn't delivered, these types of things. So he did seem to struggle, and there are certain figures that were adversarial. We have one of my coworkers, who's our archivist at the National Institute for Newman Studies, Lawrence Gregory. He's working on a project about Cardinal Vaughan, who very much did not like Newman, and until, of course, he seems to have a change of heart, at least on the surface, once he's declared a cardinal.
But it was done by Pope Leo the 13th, who's been much in the news recently because of our new Pope Leo. Do we know why Pope Leo back then was on board with cardinal, or with making Newman a cardinal?
I mean, it took everybody, including Newman, by surprise. But it seems that Pope Leo the 13th was open to kind of Newman as a figure in the church and his theology, and so it was willing to acknowledge that and give him this tremendous honor, even though Newman had not been like your typical kind of leader in the church, in terms of having a bishopric and like being able to kind of have that claim before.
And he never really moves to Rome. He still gets to live, in England, where at the time, it does seem like a unique case.
Absolutely. So it didn't seem to be much precedent for that, especially for his situation, right? Living in a context where there hadn't even been like official bishops for a long time until the hierarchy could be restored. Yeah.
I want to really focus in on sort of his contributions to Catholic thought, whether he contributed those as an Anglican or as a Catholic, because it seems to be a good mix of both, which is, I think, just like a beautiful, like, story too, that like your life doesn't start as a Catholic when you become Catholic. Like you do bring these experiences of God and faith with you. We touched on the development of doctrine a little bit. Maybe we'll come back to it more, but want to hone in on conscience, because that seems to be a place where Newman is cited as one of the great thinkers in our Catholic tradition, is sort of the right and primacy of someone's conscience. Could you maybe explain what Newman thought and also what he didn't, the way it's maybe abused today?
Newman's interest in conscience starts very early, certainly in his Anglican days. I mean, we're certainly aware of it now with works like the Grammar of Assent and the Letter to the Duke of Norfolk, which are later works in Newman's life. But it starts really early because conscience is a fundamental principle of his thought, that the human person is kind of designed for this relationship with God, and yet designed for a relationship with God who reveals things in history. And so I think there you see the unique teaching on conscience that Newman has, which is, again, a first principle of his thought, that we have this sense, this moral sense and a sense of duty within us that directly connects us to God or to the voice of God through conscience. So it's not this merely personal sentiment or something that's just constructed by society. It is the voice of the Creator within our being. And by following the voice of conscience and attending to it, we start to develop a habit and increase our sight of that reality, the voice, the authority behind conscience. If we don't listen to it, we start to dull it and we habitually kind of push it away. But what Newman really gives us is a sense that the God of conscience is also the God working through history and preparing humanity for revelation, starting, of course, with the Israelites, and then in line with the promises to Abraham, getting ready to extend the blessings of Israel to all of humanity. And that's what God ends up doing in Jesus Christ. And then, of course, it's not merely that, it's that we then receive the gift of the Spirit which then leads the church into all truth, and believers themselves receive the Spirit of baptism. So for Newman, there isn't this kind of divide that we might have today, where it's like, well, my conscience says this, so the church is wrong. I think Newman imagined more of a really deep formation of conscience in order to try to kind of increase participation in the life of the church. That doesn't mean there won't ever be any problems, but it wasn't to try to divide the individual from the church. It was intended to bring you closer, so that what was a deeply personal experience went beyond itself and connected you to the community of faith.
Well, I like his image of a clock, because obviously he compares the conscience to a clock, and you follow your clock. Maybe it's on your wrist and it's computers now, but your clock could be wrong at one point. It could be wound wrong or set to the wrong time, and that would cause you to be late to events. But on the other hand, what else do you have to do but follow your clock, even if it's going to make you to not follow it would just be nonsense. Because also,
he says, correct me if I'm wrong, but that you even have a duty to follow your conscience, even if it leads you into error in that moment.
Yes, and so we do have a duty to conscience, but then again, the conscience is also something that ought to be like, as you're living it out, if you're a member of the community of faith, that you would be desperately trying to find a way to reconcile your conscience with the teaching of the church. So I don't think Newman would be happy with it kind of being pitted against in some sort of sense that way. So, yeah, and I also think there might be a way to kind of look at Newman's thought and say, well, if you do have trouble, what's a way to kind of navigate that trouble? And I think it would be something like deep formation, study of the church, study of history, really trying to work through whatever issues you have, because Newman himself certainly had to do that multiple times in his life and career.
Well, I think that both development of doctrine and his teaching on conscience all sort of stem from this idea that God speaks to us in history, which can sound sort of, I don't know, blasé or naive or whatever, but I think it is kind of radical because, for a lot of people, there's this idea that, once the apostles die, like, there's no more God intervening in history, right? Like, that's sort of the end of teaching, that's sort of the end of revelation, and that everything just is frozen in time there. But if God does continue to act in history, it does like make for some uncomfortable conversations or realizations, especially when you consider that not only has he acted in recent history, but he's acting today, and that we actually have to be quite attentive to what is God asking of us today and for our church.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. And I think a lot of these questions I think are really connected, because Newman's thought in many ways is connected, that conscience functions deeply within the essay on development of doctrine, and also in his grammar of assent. And Newman always believed that God is working through people, working through believers, working through the church. So the individual life and the communal life, they're hugely important. You can't, it's not just that truth has been defined and that's it. I mean, it really is this robust sense of faith, like the faith that we receive, but also the faith by which we live today. And we have a job to do, and he talks early on in his career about how Athanasius was the man for his time who kind of stepped up and did what he had to do facing the Arians. I think Newman saw himself in some ways stepping up, entering the fray and the controversies of his own time. And in our time, we're called to do the very same thing. We're dealing with challenges that, even if there are parallels in the past, they're unique. And is the church going to say something? Are people going to say something? And we don't actually know exactly how things are going to develop, whether it's something like synodality and the sensus fidelium. How is that going to play out? I mean, I think we actually have a lot to do, and it's not so simple as just trying to say like everything's been done and just get in line.
Well, I think if conscience is as important as he says it is, and I would agree, I think that might connect to the other thing that Newman is really known for, which is education, and his emphasis on formation for lay Catholics, which, they weren't always the most empowered back in the 19th century. So what was his approach to, ensuring that we had well-formed lay people who could ensure that the doctrine of the faith is kept?
I really think Newman cared about people, right?
Yeah.
But for him, this was so essential that religion was getting kind of attacked on all fronts, and the very ground on which you're standing can be falling away from you. And so he felt like, no, we need to prepare people to deal with these challenges and to have a faith that can withstand them. So and this goes all the way back even to when he was at Oxford as a member of what would become the Oxford movement. But he wanted to kind of personally form Christians, conscientious and, critical thinkers who could handle new evidence and challenges, and kind of keep faith strong and robust. So this is consistent throughout his whole career, educating and forming people, which is why I think, at first I wasn't sure, because when I heard that Pope Leo XIV was going to declare him a co-patron of education with Thomas Aquinas, I had been thinking, oh, maybe this will be like, maybe he'll be the doctor of like development or modernity or something like that. But actually, there's kind of a brilliance to it, I think, because Newman was always committed to, again, forming and educating the whole person for this life of faith. And it's essential for him.
Newman sort of resists being contained to one ideology or one group or one camp. He's part of this like rare group of people that seem to transcend all of that. And even in his time, it seems like, was widely admired in a number of different groups. Why do you think that is? And what do each group today maybe see in Newman?
Yeah. So one of the things about being a doctor of the church is that not only do you need this like exemplary life of holiness and to be a saint, but you have to have eminent teaching and doctrine that will continue to inspire and lead and guide the faithful for all time, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, because people have tried to bring their agendas to his thought since his lifetime. And certainly right after he died in the modernist crisis, you see different uses of his thought. But I think it's actually really healthy that people that I went to school with who were more in like theology in a postmodern context, they like to draw upon Newman. And so do people that, are more traditional Thomists like to engage Newman. it shows that his thought can't be kind of reduced and put into any kind of a box. And he will continue to kind of inspire debate and dialogue among believers of all different stripes. And I would say that, again, to reiterate, that's healthy, because there's no Catholic is required to have a particular approach or outlook, right? And so it's good to see different engagement on Newman's thought, but there's also a sense there, once you start to use that thought, what does it allow for and what does it resist, right? And that's where people can then debate, like, you're stretching Newman too far one way or another.
I was thinking, when you mentioned that being named a doctor of the church shows that your teaching will continue to inspire, and I was laughing to myself because, they sort of observed that period for Irenaeus in 2022 when they named him. It took him like 1,800 years to be named a doctor of the church. Do you think they jumped the gun on Cardinal Newman?
Well, I mean, I might be a bit biased.
I was like, you have to say yes, or like someone's going to fire you. But
like I said, I really think the only thing holding him back was to first be canonized. And so I'm not very surprised at how quick it was. But I think there's a little bit of a sense of urgency, because Newman's thought is of such value in our own time period. Like, we're still kind of dealing with the same questions that Newman was dealing with, whether it involves religious epistemology and knowing, or an active life of spirituality. How do we deal with continuity?
Consulting the laity.
I was going to say, would he be on board with the Synod on Synodality, do you think?
I think Newman might have a problem if it's conceived as just, a democratic application to the church. But I think synodality is very much in keeping with his understanding. Like, if we're talking about the participation of the whole community of faith and kind of a communication occurring between the members of that community, I think he'd be all for it, especially given his attention to, like, councils, the life of the laity and the church. So yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot to show that he would be supportive of a church in which different parts of the body are working together.
I hope with his being named a doctor of the church that people are inspired to maybe pick up some Newman, read some Newman. He is a great writer, especially of the English language. If you're listening to this, and presumably that's something you'd like to seek out. But, like, where should people start?
Yeah,
because, like, I will say, like, an essay concerning the development of Christian doctrine, it's not an essay, it's a book. Can we just say that? So I think that trips people up sometimes. But maybe what's some more approachable stuff?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, he is a brilliant writer, but there is a little bit of a learning curve, and some of his works, like the essay In Aid of a Grammar of Assent, can be pretty dense. I always recommend to students, like, maybe read it out loud to yourself and trust the punctuation marks. Like, use those, otherwise you're going to struggle. But if I would point people anywhere, it's usually to his sermons. I think that even his Anglican sermons, the parochial and plain sermons, are just so phenomenal. They're even timely to this day. They're still speaking to each believer, convicting us of things as we go through them. So I would say that those sermons are where I would start.
Yeah, they really are brilliant. We published an article in America Magazine in, like, the 1910s or something, where someone was remarking about how Newman didn't have the qualities of a great preacher in terms of, like, the physical qualities, right? He's not this, like, strong, like, tall, booming voice. He's kind of like a quiet, feeble man, but people just loved him. And, like, without that quality, like, preaching is all kind of dead. And he had that most important ingredient.
Yeah, absolutely. I even did, like, a short piece for one of our online publications a few years ago now. And it was like people who had written detracting statements about Newman. And even one of the people that didn't find his theology all that convincing said that when he happened to be at a sermon at St. Mary's in the 1830s, it was as if a martyr or apostle had come out of the grave and started talking. The whole place was just wrapped. So he must have had some sort of presence to be able to do that.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge about St. John Henry Newman, Doctor of the Church. We do have one final question for you, and that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Oh my gosh.
Newman's done.
Yep.
What's that?
So you can't pick Newman anymore. It's already
Newman is done, and there's not really any other pinnacle to reach in the life of the church. Oh, I would be interested in looking at the case of some people like Eric Shavara from early in the 20th century. I don't know if there's any kind of movement there because I don't know if there's any miracles, but
could you remind our audience who that is and what is it?
Yeah, a great, German of Polish descent, teacher, Jesuit, I believe. I hope I got that right. Of some major figures like Rahner and von Balthasar. And so kind of a major figure for the way 20th century Catholic theology developed. And he had written a book synthesizing Newman's thought earlier, in the 20th century. And so he became kind of one of the vehicles for people getting exposed to Newman in Germany. I don't know what the standing is for him in terms of canonization, but it would be interesting to see his life and holiness and how it kind of directly benefited the church in his teaching, his instruction, and also the way that it helped Newman kind of, spread throughout German thought. Yeah.
All right. So Eric Shavara, is that the right?
Yeah.
I don't think
I'm just fascinated by him.
This is one of our nerdiest canonizations yet.
Maybe.
We love it.
It may not be a great case. I'm not sure.
Hey, we'll find out. We'll ask around. Saint Eric Shavara. Chris, want to thank you so much. If people are just like, wow, I love Newman so much. Where do I get more Newman? Where should they go?
Well, I would always tell them to come to our website, newmanstudies.org. We also maintain we manage a lot of the resources that people already use, like the Newman Reader, newmanreader.org, where you can find all of his published works in HTML. We have an absolutely phenomenal digital repository, digitalcollections.newmanstudies.org, where you can search everything all at once, looking for keywords and other types of things. So newmanstudies.org is the vehicle to our publications like the Newman Studies Journal and Newman Review. So anybody who's interested in Newman, head to that website, and we can also connect you elsewhere too.
Great. We'll link it in the show notes.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And now we have As One Friend Speaks to Another, the part of our show where we talk about where we're finding God in our lives this week and share stories of faith from around the Catholic Church. And this week we are joined by Simcha Fisher, who is a contributing writer here at America. Welcome, Simcha.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
It's great to talk to you. Wanted to talk to you about a piece that you wrote for America last week. The headline was, J.D. Vance's immigration comments are an insult to our Catholic faith. And I will say the headline makes it sound like a pretty hot take, screed. And I'll just preface it by saying there's a lot of deep spiritual reflection in there. And I want to acknowledge for the audience that, anytime we're talking politics and religion, which we do a lot on this show, it can be immediately polarizing, but I do think it's important to kind of dig a little deeper into some of the spiritual insights. And you did a great job of that in your piece. So I'm wondering if you could just start by recounting the story from your childhood and what made you think of it briefly.
Yeah. Well, the way that I thought of it was because I heard the bit of the podcast, and I did go back and listen to the rest of the podcast, just to be fair. I listened to the podcast where J.D. Vance made the remarks that upset so many people about saying that, you might be living next door to 20 people all crammed into a little house, and they don't speak your language, and you don't have anything in common with them, and there's a lot of them, and they might get rowdy, and it's perfectly normal not to want to live that way and not to want to have people like that living next door to you. And
the implication being those are immigrants, not just frat boys.
Right. Yes. Excuse me. That's kind of a salient point, isn't it? And I thought to myself, well, does he have a point? Like, it does. I understand where he's coming from, and it suddenly occurred to me that I actually have had that experience. I have had the experience of living next to immigrants. We used to live next to a safe house when we lived in a city where there was a lot of people in crisis going in and out all the time. And then also when I was very young, for the first 20 years of my life or so, actually, we lived next door to a sort of a group home for pretty profoundly disabled adults. And they had all different kinds of disabilities. They all had some kind of physical disability, and they mostly had mental disabilities as well. And I did not like it. I didn't like living there. So my immediate thought was like, yeah, JD Vance is right. Like it's uncomfortable and it's unpleasant and it sort of brings you up short all the time, making you feel like this is my house. I should be comfortable here. I shouldn't have to put up with this. And the people that I lived next door to were not dangerous, but they were kind of disruptive. They were strange. They made me uneasy. You know, they walked in strange ways and they talked in strange ways. And sometimes they made loud, unexpected noises and looked at you in weird ways. I mean, I think we've all had that experience and people don't really like talking about it. But when you do not spend a lot of time with people with intellectual disabilities and then you encounter such a person, sometimes it's hard to know how to act. And I was a little kid and I didn't like it. And I really especially didn't like it when my mother, who was a fairly new Christian, used to invite them literally into our house. She had two particular neighbors that she would invite over all the time, or maybe they invited themselves and she just decided because she was a Christian, it was her job to let them in. And that is what she did. And there was this.
And you
one
mentioned you're 6 years old. You're 6 years
yeah,
old.
I was about 6 years old. Yeah. And you know, when my friends would come over, I was embarrassed about it. And I wished that we lived next door to, you know, somebody I could play with, or like a nice old granny who'd bake me cookies or something like that. And instead we had, you know, this mess, which is how it seemed to me at the time. It just seemed like a problem and it was imposing on me. So there was this one particular guy named Bill who would come over. And he made me very uncomfortable as a little kid. He walked oddly and he had this giant massive underbite and he didn't have teeth and he didn't speak normally if he spoke at all. And he would just come over and just sort of lurk about for a while and then he would leave. So when I heard JD Vance's remarks, I thought, dang, I know what he's talking about. I know that feeling of not wanting people like that to be living next to you. You would much rather have somebody that you had a lot of things in common with. But then I thought, okay, but I was 6 years old. JD Vance is an adult. JD Vance is the vice president of the United States, and JD Vance is a Catholic who frequently sets himself up as the voice of the American Catholic Church. You know, he presents himself as somebody who speaks for American Catholics. And I thought, he's just wrong. He's just wrong. Like, he wasn't speaking about specifically even illegal immigrants. He was just saying people from another country who speak another language and people who are living crowded together in a small space. And I thought, well, that means they're being exploited. That doesn't mean they're hurting JD Vance in this hypothetical situation, you know? So, and he wasn't saying that they were being violent. He wasn't saying that they were being dirty or dangerous or anything like that. He was just saying that they were different and it made you feel uncomfortable. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that sometimes that's the case. Like these situations are not always, we can't just sort of be sweetness and light and say, okay, but we're all, you know, there's a brotherhood of man, fatherhood of God, and everything is great. Like it's kind of messy and uncomfortable sometimes. It really, really is. And, you know, I don't want to oversimplify, and I don't want to say, well, you know, a lot of people accuse me of saying, well, we should have open borders and we should just let everybody in because that's what Jesus wants us to do. And I don't think, you know, I went ahead and looked it up in the catechism, which is something that I recommend people do because I never assume that I know exactly what's going on. So I looked it up in the catechism and basically it said, if a wealthier nation can let people in so that they can be safe, then it should. You know, in a way that doesn't endanger its own citizens, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but obviously people are welcome to look that up. But, and I thought to myself, well, geez, I didn't have to look that up in the catechism because I've read the Bible, and I've been at Mass where they read the gospel readings, and I read the Old Testament where, over and over again, when somebody is a stranger in a strange land, you're supposed to let them in. And that's what Abraham did. He let people in. When somebody is a foreigner and when somebody is a stranger and when somebody is alone and needing help, if you can help them, you are supposed to. And it may be nuanced, but it's not ambiguous. You know what I mean? So the fact that we have been instructed and commanded over and over and over again to welcome the stranger, that signals that it's a hard thing.
Well, I think one of the truths that you're getting that kind of transcends even this issue in this instance is sort of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable in Christian living. I think, you mentioned God is telling us to do these things that are hard quite often, and sort of going outside of your comfort zone does strike me as something that is probably a requirement for being a disciple of Jesus at some level, at some point in your life. Maybe not all the time, but I think eventually you're going to be asked to forgive someone who has wronged you, or get up and talk in front of a group of people who you don't want to, or say you're sorry to someone that's going to be really embarrassing for you, or welcome someone who makes you uncomfortable for whatever reason. I'm curious.
Well, the sign of our church is not, a comfy bed. It is a crucifix. So that's something to think about,
Yeah. Do you have any sense of what are there muscles to build to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable, or how do are there practices that help us with that?
Well, so before you get to that, one thing that I noticed or that stood out to me in your article was kind of you acknowledging that even as a 6-year-old, your conscience was telling you it was wrong to feel bad or to not like living with these different people. And clearly you've evolved to a point where where that's not the case anymore. So there had to be something...
Well, I don't know about that, but still working on it. I'm definitely still working on it. Yeah, but that's the thing. I mean, just saying that something is normal and natural doesn't mean that it's not something that you have to work on. I think that's something that evades a lot of people for some reason. My friend Leah Labresco Sargent, I'm sure you're familiar with her. She's one of my absolute favorite humans that I've ever met. Just recently came out with a new book on feminism. She said that when she walks through Times Square as a spiritual practice, what she'll say to herself when she sees, she likes to people watch like a lot of other people do. And she says, she thinks to herself, and Jesus, looking upon him, loved him. And she just thinks those words while she's looking at other people. And I tried doing that and it works. It really
Man, when I'm walking through Times Square, it's Jesus, get these people out of my way.
Well, there's definitely, sometimes it's going to be some of that too.
Well, your piece starts recounting these times that the man Bill would come to your house and you'd feel very uncomfortable, but it ends with this really beautiful coda featuring Bill.
I was actually remembering it with my siblings, and one of my sisters reminded me of something that I'd completely forgotten this. We used to celebrate, well, we still do, we celebrate Passover every year because my family is Catholic, but our heritage is Jewish, and so we celebrate Passover every year. Part of the Passover Seder is when you pour a cup for Elijah the prophet, when he comes again, that means Jesus is going to come again, that the Savior is going to come, the Messiah is going to come. And so you pour a cup for Elijah, and at a certain point at the Seder, you open the door for Elijah, just in case he wants to show up. And, we did this every year. It's just part of the ceremony, and people have different interpretations about what it signifies. And generally nothing happens. You open the door, and then after a while you say, it's cold in here, let's close the door. So one year we opened the door and Bill came in, and right in the middle of the ceremony, and we kind of looked at each other, and my mother is like, she nudges my sister and says, give him the wine. So she says, would you like a cup of wine? Gives him Elijah's cup, and he drank it, and he put it down, and he went out again. And that was Elijah, right? Like, was it not? Was that just some kind of meaningless coincidence?
Would have been a little tough if you guys had just been like, "Oh, sorry, we're in the middle of something.
Yeah, no, right.
Could you come back later?"
We're saving this for somebody special, not you.
Yeah, we're waiting on God to send us someone.
Right.
Could you please get out of the way?
Right, exactly. It is really easy to do that. I mean, the whole point of it was that he does not look the way you would expect a prophet to look. You know, he looked like a man with very severe mental and physical disabilities. But like, if you're looking for Jesus, and I hope that we are, chances are very good that that's what he's going to look like. And the only thing that's up to you is whether or not you are ready to receive him or not.
Well, I'm confident in saying that you and in JD Vance are not the only people who struggle with difference. I can say I have in different parts of my life. So it's a very human experience. But it sounds like in your mother, you had someone who was really setting a strong example of what it means to welcome the stranger.
Yeah. She was really, really good about that. And I think people tended to recognize that she was somebody who would just sort of accept them for who they were. Like, she wasn't going to let herself be taken advantage, but she was somebody who wasn't just going to discount you because you were weird. And weird people were drawn to her. This poor shy woman had strange people attracted to her like a magnet her whole entire life. They could sense that she was somebody who was going to open the door for them, you know, and that is something that I think that we can aspire to. Like, if you're walking down the street and there's somebody who needs help, are they going to look at you and say, that looks like somebody who will help me?
Well, want to thank you for introducing us to the story, introducing us to your mom, to Bill, and asking us all to think a little bit about the things we struggle with and, you know, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. We will, Simcha will link to your article again in our show notes in case people haven't read it. But thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on. I was happy to tell the story.
Jesuitical is made by us, Sebastian Gomes, Will Gualtieri, and Kevin Christopher Robles. Faith formation provided by Father Eric Sundrup, SJ. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, or like the show on your favorite platforms. You can support Jesuitical by subscribing to America Magazine at americamagazine.org. I'm Ashley McKinless with Zach Davis. We'll see you next week.